Notice, this story is connected to two previous cases that achieved incredible success, and I want to personally thank everyone for making them what they are today. But I have a question for you, boss. I know exactly how you look at this kind of horror. I know you dismiss spiritual entities, ancient manifestations, and metaphysical terrors as nothing more than uneducated folklore, superstitious nonsense manufactured by backward societies that are simply afraid of the dark. You pride yourself on modern logic, clinical facts, and practical science. But I promise you right now, by the time we reach the end of this cold Pacific night, you are going to believe every single thing you used to deny. The distortion of my life began on a miserable, rain-slicked Tuesday when I woke up at exactly 2 in the morning to the aggressive, continuous vibration of my secure personal phone. I rolled over in the dark, my eyes straining against the harsh glare of the screen to read a highly urgent, high-priority encrypted transmission from the chief administrator of an old municipal hospital in Seattle, Washington. The digital message was brief, demanding, and utterly bizarre. They required my immediate, exclusive presence on the West Coast to perform a specialized autopsy on a highly sensitive casualty, and the board explicitly stated I could write down any monetary figure I desired on the blank requisition ledger. I stared at the flashing text in the dark, a cold draft from the apartment window hitting my neck. I remember asking myself if the entire West Coast had suddenly run out of licensed forensic pathologists, or if the medical examiners in the state of Washington had lost their scalpels. The sheer financial desperation of the request felt wrong, a heavy red flag disguised as a massive payday. But the academic anomaly pulled at my curiosity, and within 4 hours, I was sitting in a commercial flight heading straight into the thick, suffocating gray fog of the Pacific Northwest. By the time the transport vehicle dropped me off at the service entrance of the hospital, the relentless Seattle rain had soaked through the heavy wool of my trench coat, chilling me straight to the bone. The facility was an imposing, brutalist concrete monolith built near the edge of the dense pine forests, its outer walls stained dark with decades of industrial soot, moisture, and moss. The air outside carried a heavy, ancient dampness that didn't just sit on your skin, it felt as though it was actively trying to seep into your lungs to drown you from the inside out. I pulled my equipment case through the automated intake doors, the rubber wheels squeaking loudly against the pristine, yellowed linoleum floor of the empty reception lobby. There were no security guards at the main desk, no overnight receptionists checking administrative badges, and no sound of distant gurneys rolling down the halls. The silence in the corridors was absolute and vacuum-like, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy thumping of my own boots echoing off the cold concrete. I found the central elevator shaft, pressed the worn plastic button for the sub-basement morgue, and watched the rusted iron doors slide shut with a heavy, metallic groan that felt exactly like the closing of a tomb. The rusted, agonizingly slow iron elevator doors scraped open with a screech of tortured metal, exposing a subterranean viewing room drenched in a pale, sterile, and sickly amber light that seemed to pulse and actively vibrate with a low-frequency hum. I pulled my heavy, rattling equipment case across the threshold, my eyes locking instantly onto the center island of the main dissection suite. Even from 20 feet away, the sheer, impossible scale of what was lying on that cold, blood-stained stainless steel table made my professional momentum come to a dead, horrified stop. I have documented thousands of casualties over my long, grueling career in New York, boss, victims of every sickening violent trauma, structural collapse, and industrial catastrophe known to modern forensics, but nothing, not even the darkest corners of my medical training, prepared me for the sheer, blasphemous biological distortion resting in the center of that light-drowned room. The corpse was that of a grown man, but his physical dimensions were so wildly, aggressively, and violently exaggerated that he looked like a twisted, hate-filled caricature of human anatomy. He was easily over 7 feet of rotting mountain, his massive, bloated chest and shoulders spilling off the sides of the heavy-duty metal table as if the reinforced steel itself were buckling, groaning, and twisting under his unnatural, suffocating weight. Every single square inch of his skin was completely, uniformly charred into a thick, cracked, coal-black crust that looked less like flesh and more like a blistered, burnt landscape. The intense, hellish heat of the fire that claimed him had split his flesh open in deep, jagged, and cavernous fissures, but instead of showing the familiar, comforting sight of red muscle tissue or white bone, the inside of these wounds looked like the dense, compressed, and rotting interior of an ancient, demonic tree trunk that had been burning from the core outward for centuries. I approached the table slowly, my boots clicking with a hollow sound, the smell hitting me like a physical, suffocating blow to the solar plexus. It wasn't the sweet, nauseating scent of standard organic rot, but a heavy, rancid, and suffocating mixture of raw sulfur, biting old soot, and the cold, wet, decaying smell of pine needles rotting in a swamp. I reached for the intake clipboard resting on the metal counter to verify the victim's identity, my hands shaking as I scanned the official documentation provided by the state. The text on the page felt like a cruel, twisted joke. The casualty was identified as Dr. Arthur Vance, a highly prominent, wealthy dermatologist who had operated a successful cosmetic practice right in the affluent, sterile heart of downtown Seattle. The paperwork stated he had vanished into the dense, shadowed forests near the Cascade Mountains 3 days prior, only for his remains to be recovered from the center of a bizarre, isolated, and impossible forest fire that had consumed nothing but his own vehicle and the ground immediately beneath his boots, leaving the surrounding woods untouched. I stared from the document back to the massive, blackened, and inhuman giant on the table, a wave of vertigo threatening to drop me to my knees. It was medically and physically impossible. A standard car fire doesn't multiply a man's bone density, tear his tendons into ropes, or double his physical volume. It reduces a human body to a pile of gray ash and brittle, unrecognizable fragments. Yet Dr. Vance's frame had grotesquely expanded, his jaw locked open in a wide, silent, and eternal scream of absolute, cosmic agony, his teeth completely blackened but perfectly, impossibly intact. I pulled a pair of thick, clinical nitrile gloves from the wall dispenser, the sharp, snapping sound of the rubber echoing violently through the dead-quiet room like a gunshot. As I stepped up to the very edge of the table to begin my external examination, the air temperature in the room suddenly took a sharp, aggressive, and bone-freezing dive, as if the room itself were dying. My breath began to cloud before my face in thick, gray, spectral plumes, and a low, dry, and frantic scratching sound, like thousands of microscopic, hungry wood insects burrowing through dead, calcified bark, began to echo directly from the hollow, lightless interior of the giant's chest cavity, rhythmic and hungry, as if something inside were still waiting to burst free. If you'd like to get the previous 2 parts, I've made it easy for you and created a playlist called Secrets of the Dead. Let's continue. I stood over the massive, blackened chest of Dr. Vance, my gloved fingers hovering just inches above the deep, charred fissures in his skin. The dry, insect-like scratching sound from inside his chest cavity suddenly died down, leaving the room in a state of absolute, heavy silence that felt like the atmosphere being sucked out of my lungs. I took a deep breath to steady my focus, turning toward the secondary instrument counter to prepare my initial markers. That was when the strange, vacuum-like quality of the building finally registered in my mind with a sickening jolt of alarm. When I first walked through the service entrance, there had been a skeleton crew of overnight medical staff, a couple of frantic administrative clerks by the side offices, and an old building engineer monitoring the main boiler valves. But now, as I looked through the thick, reinforced glass observation window that separated my dissection suite from the main preparation corridor, the entire facility looked utterly, impossibly dead. The long, white-tiled hallway outside was completely vacant, a sterile, glowing corridor of abandonment. The desk lamps in the administrative alcoves were still glowing, casting long, lonely, and distorted shadows across the linoleum, and a half-empty mug of coffee was still steaming on the security desk right past the double doors, a lingering, pathetic monument to a life interrupted. I walked over to the heavy steel door of my suite, pushed it open, and stepped out into the main corridor, my boots making a sharp, solitary clicking sound against the hard, unforgiving floor. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin, fragile, and alien as it bounced off the cold concrete walls before dying out in a suffocating, unnatural void, devoid of even a single hint of an echo. "Is anyone on this floor?" No answer. Only the aggressive, oppressive silence of a tomb. I walked down the length of the hallway, checking the adjacent pathology labs, the specimen storage lockers, and the main break room. Every single door was unlocked, every computer terminal was fully logged in with their digital screens flickering in the dark, but there wasn't a single living soul left in the entire building. They hadn't just stepped out for a break, boss, they had fled in a state of primal, unadulterated terror. The lockers in the staff room were left wide open, expensive coats were still hanging on the wooden pegs, and car keys were sitting completely abandoned on the main counter like discarded remnants of a shattered reality. The moment the word spread through the building that Dr. Ferris had entered the basement to begin the incision on the giant, every single doctor, nurse, and security guard had dropped their equipment and run straight for their vehicles, abandoning their posts to drive home through the pouring, blinding rain. They knew exactly what was inside that body, and they had left me completely, cruelly alone in the dark to face the monstrosity. I slowly walked back into my dissection suite, the heavy steel security door clicking shut behind me with a loud, definitive, and final mechanical snap that sounded exactly like a rusted padlock sealing a grave. The air inside the room had grown even colder during my brief absence, the sharp, biting temperature making my fingers stiffen painfully inside my protective gloves. I looked back at the center table, forcing my analytical mind to violently block out the creeping, oily, and psychological dread that was beginning to coat my thoughts like thick, black bile. I was entirely on my own now, thousands of miles away from my sanctuary in New York, trapped inside a deserted West Coast hospital with a 7-foot charred anomaly that a whole city was terrified to even look at. I gripped the handle of my scalpel, my knuckles white and straining, stepping back up to the edge of the steel table, determined to let the cold, unforgiving blade find the truth before the encroaching, suffocating dark finally found me. The silence of the abandoned hospital pressed against the walls with a physical weight, a stillness that felt like being buried alive in a tomb of concrete. I gripped the cold steel handle of my scalpel, my bandaged hand throbbing with a dull ache that pulsed in time with my racing heart, counting down the agonizing seconds of my survival. I leaned over the massive, necrotic chest of Dr. Arthur Vance, positioning the razor-sharp blade at the base of his sternum to begin the Y-incision. I needed to see what was festering inside this giant, to find a biological cause that could explain how a human could expand to twice his natural volume, mutating into a hulking, charred effigy of life that defied every law of nature I had ever studied. Before my blade could graze his charred, wood-like crust, a dry, bone-sickening friction echoed through the room, like tectonic plates shifting in a grave. It wasn't an external noise, it was the sound of heavy, calcified joints forcing themselves to grind against decades of rigor mortis, the sound of bone snapping against itself. A dense, putrid ash began to flake off the giant's shoulders, falling onto the table with a rhythmic, mocking pattering that resembled a deadly winter snowfall. There was no draft in the room. The ash was falling because the corpse was actively vibrating, a microscopic, high-frequency tremor rippling beneath the charred fissures of his blackened flesh. I froze, my scalpel suspended in the stagnant air, my eyes locked on the giant's grotesque face. The stench of raw sulfur and wet, rotting pine needles spiked, becoming so violently thick that it made my eyes stream with burning tears and my throat sear with a dry, chemical heat that tasted like swallowed poison. Then, the pattering of the ash grew louder, shifting into a heavy, relentless scratching, the sound of splintering wood grinding against stone. Slowly, with an agonizingly stiff, horrifyingly fluid motion, the giant's blackened torso began to rise. His chest lifted, his spine arching backward at a terrifying angle that should have pulverized his burned vertebrae into splinters. His head rolled back, his unhinged, cavernous jaw stretching open toward the ceiling as a dense, suffocating plume of gray soot and toxic ash erupted from his throat, clouding the dying light in a whirlwind of particulate death that felt like the very breath of hell itself. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on the slick tile, my back slamming against the instrument counter. The trays rattled, the sharp forceps and heavy clamps clinking in a frantic percussion that echoed the rhythm of my own racing pulse. For 3 agonizing seconds, the giant sat impossibly upright, a towering, nightmarish monument of burnt, corrupted wood and ancient rot, staring into the dark with sightless, void-filled sockets that seemed to look through my soul. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the force holding him up collapsed. The massive weight of his torso fell backward with a bone-crushing, metallic crash that vibrated through the foundation of the floor, rattling my teeth. The room returned to a freezing stillness, but the air was now thick with swirling soot that settled over me like a funeral shroud. I stood pressed against the counter, my knuckles white as I gripped the steel, my chest heaving as I stared at the silent corpse. The clinical reality of my profession was melting away into the Seattle cold. A body does not sit up on its own, boss. Air trapped in the lungs can cause a minor groan, but it cannot defy gravity to lift a 300-pound frame of charred, calcified bone. Whatever had taken root inside Dr. Vance wasn't just using his cells, it was rewriting the physical laws of his biology, turning his corpse into a conductor for a spiritual malice that had driven an entire hospital staff to flee for their lives into the heart of the night, leaving me trapped in this hellish basement with the ancient, nameless horror he had become. I forced my ragged, gasping breathing to slow down, battling the primal, shrieking impulse to run as I refused to let the suffocating psychological dread paralyze my hands. I needed to wash the vile, gray soot from my face and clear my vision from the swirling haze of my own terror. I turned away from the examination table for no more than 40 agonizing seconds, walking to the industrial, stainless steel scrub sink in the far corner of the room to splash freezing, biting tap water over my eyes. The sharp, metallic scent of the municipal water line did absolutely nothing to clear the heavy, sulfurous, and rotting stench that had settled deep into the fibers of my scrubs and the lining of my lungs. I grabbed a rough paper towel, dried my burning face with trembling hands, and turned back toward the center island, intent to secure the table with heavy-duty, thick leather restraints before the corpse could experience another violent, post-mortem muscular spasm that might tear this room apart. But when I stepped back into the flickering, jaundiced amber light of the dissection suite, the breath was completely, violently knocked from my lungs, leaving me wheezing in the thick, stale air. The stainless steel examination table was completely, impossibly empty. The heavy, cold metal surface where the massive, charred, and nightmarish giant had been resting less than a minute ago was utterly bare, showing nothing but a thick, oily, and greasy smear of coal-black soot and a few scattered, mocking flakes of gray, necrotic ash that still pulsated with a faint, heat-hazed glow. There were no drag marks on the linoleum floor, no sound of heavy, earth-shaking footsteps echoing down the hall, and the massive, reinforced steel door of my suite was still securely locked from the inside, its heavy mechanical deadbolt firmly, tauntingly in place. A 7-foot, 300-pound charred, calcified casualty could not simply vanish or walk out of a hermetically locked room without making a single, vibration-shattering sound. I gripped my scalpel so tightly that the metal dug into my palm, my knuckles turning bloodless white as I approached the empty table, my eyes scanning the dark, shifting corners of the room for any sign of the monster. That was when I noticed a faint, rhythmic, and wet dragging sound echoing from the ventilation shaft directly above my head, the sound of dense, heavy, and charred flesh scraping against jagged sheet metal like a razor on skin. I unlocked the security door and stepped out into the dark, desolate, and abandoned corridors of the hospital, my solitary, frantic footsteps clicking against the linoleum as I followed the structural, haunting layout of the building's infrastructure. The air grew progressively, unnaturally warmer as I ascended the damp concrete stairwell to the upper floors, shifting from the freezing, tomb-like cold of the morgue to a dry, artificial, and suffocating heat that smelled faintly of burning insulation and frying human hair. I reached the third floor, the plastic, peeling signage on the wall reading inpatient wards. The long, desolate corridor was cast in a deep, menacing shadow, the overhead lights turned off for the night, leaving only the dim, sickly green glow of the exit signs to illuminate the empty, tomb-like nursing stations. I walked past several vacant rooms, the silence thick enough to choke on, until I reached the very end of the hall, where the heavy wooden door to room 302 was hanging wide open, swinging slightly on its rusted hinges. I stepped inside, and the sight froze the blood in my veins, turning my heart to solid, panicked lead. The massive, blackened, and inhuman frame of Dr. Arthur Vance was lying perfectly flat on a small, white metal patient bed that was buckling, screaming, and groaning under his immense, impossible weight, the frame bending until it was mere seconds from snapping. His long, charred, and rigid legs hung clumsily over the edge of the mattress, twitching with the residual energy of the abyss, and his unhinged, coal-black jaw was turned toward the window, as if he were an ordinary, peaceful patient watching the relentless, uncaring Seattle rain wash away the world outside. The room felt crowded, not by presence, but by an encroaching, psychic pressure that made my skin crawl with the sensation of thousands of invisible, spectral teeth grazing my neck. I stood there, trapped in the doorway, staring at the monster that refused to die, realizing with a sick, sinking clarity that it wasn't just existing, it was waiting for me to walk into its reach so it could finish the butchery it had started in the deep, freezing dark of the basement. The small patient room smelled intensely of dry, suffocating rot and scorched, oily wool, a stench that tasted like a graveyard unearthed in the middle of a furnace. I stood frozen in the doorway of room 302, my knuckles white, my scalpel gripped with a desperate, white-knuckled fervor in my hand, watching the rhythmic, heaving, and unnatural chest of the blackened giant. The modern medical equipment mounted on the wall beside the bed, the digital vitals monitors and plastic oxygen regulators, began to crackle, spark, and hiss with a malevolent, electrical, and demonic fervor. Their screens didn't merely flash with error codes, the glass displays shattered violently from within, tiny, lethal fragments of glass pinging against the linoleum floor like shrapnel as a low, suffocating, and absolute pressure began to fill the small space, making the very air feel thick, gelatinous, and impossible to inhale, as if the room itself were trying to strangle the life out of my lungs. Before I could back away into the dark corridor, a sharp, white-hot agony flared behind my temples, a blinding, invasive sensation like a rusted iron spike driving straight through my cerebral cortex to pin my consciousness to the wall of my own skull. The walls of room 302 began to warp, bleed, and dissolve before my eyes, the white plaster melting away like putrid, decaying flesh to reveal a shifting, dreamlike nightmare that defied the waking world. I was no longer standing in a clinical ward, boss. My mind was being forcefully, violently dragged into a deep, suffocating forest under a pitch-black, suffocating sky that seemed to watch me with a million unseen eyes. I could feel the freezing, icy Seattle rain slashing against my face like needles, and all around me, massive, ancient pine trees were burning with a silent, unnatural blue flame that cast no heat, only a creeping, parasitic cold that seeped into my marrow and turned my blood to slush. Then, a voice materialized directly inside my head, not a sound traveling through the air, but a heavy, echoing, and dissonant vibration that tore through my own thoughts like a rusted, serrated blade. It was the voice of Dr. Arthur Vance, but it was layered with a sickening, ancient, and gravelly resonance that sounded like a shifting, cracking tectonic plate deep within the bowels of the earth. "You shouldn't have opened the door, Ferris," the voice groaned, dripping with a profound, crushing sorrow that felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, threatening to shatter my ribs and liquefy my organs. Asterisk, we thought the fire would contain it. We thought the wood would hold the marrow. But the roots go deeper than the concrete, and now, you are the soil. Asterisk along with the words, a flood of borrowed, agonizing guilt crashed into my psyche, memories of every patient I couldn't save in Cairo, every legal failure from my past, and the twisted, screaming faces of the dead I had documented over the years. The entity inside the giant was using Vance's fractured memories as a conduit, weaponizing my own mind to break my psychological defenses and drain my spiritual will, leaving me a hollow, shaking shell for it to occupy and discard. I fell to my knees on the cold floor, my hands clutching my skull as the illusions of the burning forest grew brighter and the agonizing guilt threatened to dissolve my very sense of self into a puddle of madness. The creature wasn't just a physical anomaly on a slab, it was a spiritual predator, a parasite that fed on the psychological fractures of the living, tearing them open to gorge on the marrow of my memories, leaving nothing behind but the stench of my own failure. I bit my lip until I tasted the copper, metallic tang of blood, using the localized, sharp physical pain to anchor myself back to the failing reality of the hospital. Slowly, the burning, ghost pines faded, and the cracked, yellowing plaster walls of room 302 materialized back around me. The giant on the bed hadn't moved an inch, but his sightless, blackened sockets were now turned directly toward me, and a slow, mocking, and wet hiss of hot, pressurized ash escaped his unhinged mouth, a sound of pure, ancient, and deeply satisfied malice that promised me an eternity of screaming. The physical weight of the psychological attack left my muscles trembling, my boots scraping against the gritty floor of room 302 as I forced myself up. I could still taste the bitter, metallic copper of my own blood. I knew if I left this entity in the patient wards, it would continue to expand its spiritual territory, turning the hospital into a playground for its malice. I had to get the casualty down to the morgue. I approached the buckling patient bed, my hands shaking inside my heavy gloves as I unlocked the manual caster wheels. Moving a 7-foot, 300-pound charred anomaly should have been an impossible chore, but the moment I gripped the steel frame, the mattress tilted, and Dr. Arthur Vance slid off. It didn't fall with the limp weight of a corpse, it dropped like a solid block of petrified wood, hitting the floor with a structural thud that caused the floorboards to vibrate. Before I could secure a grip under his blackened shoulders, the soot covering his chest began to swirl into a mini-vortex. The air pressure dropped so rapidly that my ears popped, and a split second later, the room was empty. The giant had vanished, leaving nothing but the scorched outline of his frame burned into the linoleum. I didn't waste time searching. I knew this entity was drawn to the structural arteries of the building, the pipes, the vents, the places where the energy was concentrated. I ran toward the stairwell, my footsteps echoing as I bypassed the lobby and descended deeper, heading past the morgue level until I reached the foundation, the sub-basement boiler room. Pushing through the heavy iron door, the contrast was jarring. The boiler room should have been a screaming inferno of noise and steam. Instead, the chamber was wrapped in a terrifying, absolute stillness. The massive iron boilers stood like rusted monuments, their pressure gauges dead and dark. The air was so aggressively cold that my eyes stung, the moisture on my eyelashes freezing within seconds. Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass, my lungs burning against an unnatural, sub-zero atmosphere. I pulled my flashlight, casting a flickering beam across the maze of cast iron pipes. The light cut through the thick frost and locked onto the primary radiator assembly. Lying directly on top of the freezing iron was the blackened giant. Dr. Vance's wood-like limbs were woven through the gaps of the pipes, his arms wrapped around the steam lines as if embracing the architecture. But he wasn't absorbing heat, his body was the source of the absolute freeze. The fissures across his chest were pulsing with a faint, sickly blue luminescence, and wherever his petrified flesh made contact with the steel, jagged sheets of white frost were actively creeping along the metal, freezing the lines solid. The rime spread with aggressive speed, crawling up the walls like a living fungus. As I watched the ice distort the stone, the soot coating the floor lifted, drifting toward the walls. The particles began to cluster together, forming dense patterns. My flashlight beam trembled as I traced the shapes. The ash was forming the unmistakable contours of human faces, hundreds of tiny, screaming countenances with hollow eyes, stretched out across the concrete like a mural of damned souls trapped beneath a frozen lake. A collective moaning sound, the sound of wind rushing through a deep, subterranean cavern, began to vibrate from the pipes. The metal was screaming under the thermal stress, a rhythmic, deafening creak that echoed the ancient, cosmic hunger of the entity that had claimed this space. I stood frozen near the iron door, the cold rapidly deadening the sensation in my boots. I realized with a gut-wrenching, paralyzing horror that the walls themselves were beginning to sweat a thick, black, viscous tar that smelled of old, wet graves and burnt memories. I was no longer just chasing a rogue casualty. I was standing inside the heart of a spiritual engine that was freezing the modern world into a permanent, calcified tomb of ash and suffering, and I was the final fuel it needed to ignite the end. The low, collective moaning from the frozen iron pipes didn't just rattle the plumbing, it began to loosen the very fabric of my immediate surroundings. I took a step back toward the heavy iron door of the boiler room, my boots crunching loudly over the thick frost coating the floor, but my hand met nothing but cold, wet stone. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the gray mist, only to find that the exit had entirely vanished. The uninsulated iron door was gone, replaced by a seamless, unending wall of damp, soot-stained concrete that seemed to stretch into the dark indefinitely. The entity wasn't just moving its physical vessel anymore, boss. It was completely rewriting the geometry of the hospital, locking me inside a localized, shifting labyrinth where space and distance had lost all clinical meaning. I held the flashlight steady, forcing my eyes to focus through the thin layer of ice forming on my lashes. I turned away from the blank wall and began to walk down what should have been a narrow maintenance crawl space, but the corridor expanded aggressively with every step I took. The concrete floor flattened out into a wide, endless hallway draped in an absolute, suffocating dark that my amber beam could barely pierce. The air smelled intensely of scorched pine and stale, stagnant river water, a heavy combination that coated the back of my throat like a layer of dry soot. I walked for what felt like miles in that shifting silence, the rhythmic clicking of my boots the only sound in the vacuum. Then, up ahead, a shape began to materialize out of the shadows. A solitary, vintage wooden chair sat directly in the center of the wide corridor, illuminated by a single, flickering amber bulb that hung from a rusted wire in the ceiling panels. Sitting perfectly upright in the chair, his massive, 7-foot frame spilling over the armrests, was the charred giant. Dr. Arthur Vance was waiting for me. His coal-black arms were resting flat on his knees, his petrified fingers locked in place like burnt branches. His head was tilted slightly to the side, his sightless, blackened eye socket staring directly into the dark space where I stood. I stopped 20 feet away, my scalpel held low at my side. The absolute stillness of his form was a trap, a psychological anchor designed to make me turn and run into the dark where the labyrinth would swallow me whole. Before I could even draw a breath to speak, the giant's unhinged jaw shifted. A low, wet, high-frequency hiss erupted from his throat, followed by a sound that made the cartilage in my ears ache with sudden pressure. It was a synchronized chorus of whispers, not just one voice, but hundreds of distinct, overlapping human tongues speaking directly inside my skull. They weren't speaking English, nor were they using any modern dialect I had encountered during my studies. It was a rhythmic, ancient phonetic chant that sounded like the crushing of dry autumn leaves and the scraping of heavy stones. Along with the chant, a violent wave of nausea hit my stomach, and a warm, trickling sensation began to run down the side of my jaw. I reached up with my gloved hand, wiping the fluid away from my earlobe. When I held my fingers up to the flashlight beam, the glove was stained with bright, living crimson. The sheer spiritual frequency of the entity's voice was violently vibrating the delicate vessels inside my ears, causing them to bleed from the absolute friction of its presence. I didn't step back. I wiped the blood on my scrubs, my eyes locking onto the pulsing blue luminescence deep within the cracks of the giant's face. "You are a long way from the Nile, Ferris." The collective whispers suddenly shifted into an agonizingly clear American English, the tone dripping with a cold, predatory amusement that echoed off the invisible walls. Asterisk, the stone of this city cannot shield you. Your white coats cannot save you. You are already inside the wood. Asterisk. The moment the final syllable left his unhinged mouth, the single amber bulb above the chair shattered with a sharp explosion, plunging the corridor into total darkness. I clicked my flashlight back on, sweeping the beam across the space in a frantic arc, but the chair was empty. The giant was gone again, leaving nothing behind but a fresh pile of gray soot and a trail of bloody, oversized footprints that led directly into the dark walls of the next corridor. The absolute, suffocating dark of the shifting corridor did not lift, but the trail of bloody, oversized, and claw-like footprints left me with only one logical, hellish trajectory. I followed the crimson, arterial stains as they wound through the distorted, nausea-inducing geometry of the building, descending a flight of stairs that shouldn't have been there, until the heavy, cloying scent of formalin and old, oxidized copper confirmed my location. The labyrinth had looped back on itself with malicious intent. I was standing once again inside the subterranean, tomb-like isolation of my original dissection suite. The bright, buzzing white LED panels overhead were flickering erratically, casting a frantic, strobing, and disorienting light over the center island. There, lying flat on the stainless steel table as if he had never left, was the giant, his presence warping the very air around him. I was done playing his psychological game of hide-and-seek, boss. My ears were still trickling with warm, thick blood, my muscles were stiff and vibrating from the unnatural, bone-shattering sub-zero cold, and the primal, ancestral instinct buried deep inside me screamed that the only way to break a curse that had woven itself into physical matter was to expose its core to the cruel, clinical light of reality. I could not fight this entity with a Western textbook, but I could use my scalpel to dismantle its physical conductor. If this creature wanted to use Dr. Vance's biology as a parasitic engine, I would tear that engine apart, sinew by sinew, piece by rotting piece. I stepped up to the edge of the steel table, my boots sticky, sliding in the pooling, congealing blood and oily soot that coated the floor. I didn't hesitate for a heartbeat. I gripped the heavy, cold steel handle of my scalpel, pressed the razor-sharp, surgical edge directly into the base of the giant's charred, coal-like throat, and dragged it down with a firm, relentless, and shuddering motion all the way to his pelvic bone, parting the blackened crust like a knife through soft, putrid meat. The moment the blade pierced the coal-black, calcified crust, there was no rush of familiar biological fluids, no hiss of escaping, standard post-mortem gases, and no sign of human marrow. Instead, a deep, earth-shaking, and soul-harrowing groan echoed from the table as the thick, petrified, and resinous flesh peeled back under my blade with a wet, sickening tear. I forced the heavy rib cage open using the industrial, rusted bone shears, the calcified sternum snapping and shattering with a violent, deafening, and splintering sound that resembled a massive, ancient oak tree breaking in half during the fury of a winter storm. I shone my flashlight directly into the exposed, cavernous thoracic cavity, and the sight made my analytical mind grind to a jagged, agonizing halt. Dr. Vance's lungs, heart, and all internal organs were completely, violently excavated. In their place, the interior of his massive, hollowed-out torso was entirely packed with a dense, writhing, and pulsating mass of ancient, ink-black, and parasitic tree roots that seemed to hum with a hateful life. The roots were alive, undulating and twitching with that same sickly, bioluminescent blue light I had seen in the boiler room. They were tightly, cruelly wound around his spine, boring deep into his brittle vertebrae and stretching up through his neck like a complex, pulsating network of parasitic veins. Packed tightly between the wet, shifting, and rotting wood was a dense mass of gray, abrasive volcanic ash and ancient, waterlogged pine needles that smelled intensely of sulfur, grave dirt, and primordial rot. This man hadn't died in a simple vehicle accident, boss. His wealth, his prestigious dermatology practice, his modern, polished life, it was all a brittle facade. He had gone into those dark, forgotten Cascade forests to participate in an ancient, agonizing spiritual ritual, offering his own living, screaming flesh to a cosmic, bottomless hunger that had existed long before the first concrete foundation was poured in Seattle. He had filled his marrow with the malignant roots of the dark woods, and now, that curse was desperately trying to find a new, living home in me. As I reached in with my surgical forceps to sever the primary, throbbing root cluster connected to the spine, the giant's charred, brittle hands suddenly shot upward with terrifying, hydraulic speed, his petrified, talon-like fingers locking onto my wrists with a brutal, bone-crushing, and inescapable tightness that pinned my arms directly over his open, wooden, and cavernous chest. The pressure was immense, as if a steel vise had clamped onto my pulse, and I could feel the cold, wood-like decay from his skin seeping into my own pores, poisoning my blood with his ancient, suffocating, and eternal darkness. The petrified fingers of the giant clamped around my wrists like twin iron, serrated vices, the rough, coal-black bark of his skin grinding into my flesh with a brutal, bone-splintering pressure. I was pinned directly over his open thoracic cavity, my face mere inches away from the writhing, slick mass of bioluminescent black roots that choked his chest. The sickly blue light pulsed frantically, casting grotesque, dancing shadows across the white ceiling panels as the suffocating, rancid smell of sulfur and wet pine needles flooded my senses, choking the oxygen right out of my lungs until my vision began to tunnel into a terrifying, starless black. I writhed against his inhuman grip, trying to leverage my weight to snap my wrists free, but it was like trying to break the hold of a calcified, ancient oak tree. The giant didn't just hold me, he began to pull me down with unnatural, grinding force, dragging my chest closer and closer to the open, hollow, and decaying trench of his torso. From deep within the wet wood and sharp, volcanic ash packing his chest, the roots began to unfurl like a cluster of starving, multi-headed black serpents, their sharp, needle-like tips rising into the air, reaching hungrily for my face, my eyes, and the open wound on my bandaged left hand with a predatory, calculated malice that made my skin crawl with the icy touch of death. The collective whispers inside my head erupted into a deafening, triumphant roar that made my vision blur and my brain scream in agony. The circle must be completed, Ferris, the entity chanted through the echoes of hundreds of dead, shrieking voices, the psychic friction causing a fresh, hot trickle of blood to run from my ears down my neck. Asterisk, the West Coast demands a modern shepherd. Your blood is old, your vessel is strong. Yield the marrow and become the dark. Asterisk, I could feel the intense, sub-zero, soul-numbing cold radiating from the roots, a paralysis creeping up my forearms, threatening to freeze my nervous system solid before the wood could pierce my skin and take root in my own blood. With a final, desperate surge of raw physical momentum, I stopped pulling backward and instead slammed my weight entirely forward. I drove my head down, smashing my forehead directly into the giant's locked, unhinged jaw with the force of a battering ram. The impact was brutal, a sharp, sickening crack echoing through the suite as the force broke the calcified joint of his mandible. The sudden, physical shock wave traveled through his petrified nervous system, causing his fingers to twitch and loosen their grip for a fraction of a second. It was all the window I needed. I yanked my right hand free, leaving a layer of torn skin against his rough, bark-like palm, and scrambled backward off the dissection table, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged, dying bird. I didn't run for the locked door. I knew the labyrinth would only throw me back into his territory. I looked across the room and saw that the giant's grip had pulled me toward the southern wall, the boundary that shared a structural brick partition with the hospital's old, abandoned non-denominational chapel. The entity knew what was coming. The moment my boots hit the floor, the table beneath the giant groaned and vibrated violently, and before the white LED panels could even strobe a second time, the massive, open-chested, rotting corpse vanished from the stainless steel, leaving only the wet, black smear of his presence. I threw myself against the heavy wooden double doors at the end of the morgue corridor, kicking them open to reveal the dim, cavernous sanctuary of the forgotten chapel. The air inside was completely different. It didn't smell of medicine or formalin, but of ancient, suffocating dust, rotting cedar wood, and stale, acidic altar wine. The rows of empty oak pews were covered in thick layers of gray, graveyard dust, all pointing toward the elevated, blood-stained stone altar at the front of the nave. Lying flat across that holy stone structure, like a grotesque, blasphemous parody of a religious sacrifice, was the giant. His chest was still split wide open, the black roots thrashing wildly against the cold, dead air of the sanctuary. The moment I stepped over the threshold, the tall, decorative wax candles standing in the heavy iron candelabras along the walls ignited simultaneously, bursting into tall, flickering plumes of an unnatural, freezing blue flame that cast no heat, plunging the holy, desecrated space into a domain of absolute, spiritual, and eternal shadow. The freezing blue flames of the chapel candles stretched upward, casting long, monstrous shadows that danced across the vaulted cedar ceiling of the sanctuary. I stood at the back of the nave, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind me with a thunderous boom that vibrated through my chest. The air inside the chapel was so violently cold that each breath I took crystallized instantly into a thick, gray cloud before my face. On the stone altar at the far end of the room, the 7-foot, charred frame of Dr. Arthur Vance began to change. He didn't just lie there anymore, boss. The mass of black tree roots filling his open chest cavity began to expand aggressively, bursting out of his thoracic cage like a nest of awakened serpents. The wood wrapped around the stone pillars of the altar, anchoring his massive frame to the building itself. Then, a thick, semi-translucent specter of pure soot and freezing mist began to materialize directly above the corpse, rising from the open chest like smoke from a dying bonfire. The shadow stretched, widening until it took on the terrifying, distorted silhouette of a towering, faceless man composed entirely of burning ash and swirling gray fog. The collective whispers in my skull became a deafening, localized screech that threatened to rupture my eardrums. The pews on either side of the aisle began to rattle violently against the floorboards, and the thick layer of dust covering the room lifted into the air, swirling into a blinding vortex. The entity wasn't just trying to break my mind anymore, it was mobilizing its entire spiritual domain to crush my consciousness and hollow out my body to make it a vessel for the dark woods of the Pacific Northwest. Your logic is a crumbling wall, Ferris, the entity roared through the psychic link, its voice a mixture of grinding stones and howling winter wind. Asterisk, you cannot diagnose a curse. You cannot dissect a god. Kneel, and let the roots take their place. Asterisk. The psychological pressure hit me like a physical tidal wave, forcing me down to one knee in the center aisle. My vision began to fail, the edges of my sight turning pitch black as my own darkest memories, the long, sleepless nights of failure, the cold faces of the anonymous dead on my New York tables, surged to the surface of my mind, weaponized by the entity to drain my will to live. I could feel my fingers growing numb, the warmth leaving my body as the unnatural freeze began to settle deep within my bone marrow. But they underestimate us, boss. They think because we rely on science and clinical facts that we don't understand the ancient architecture of the soul. My family's roots run through the old soil of Egypt, a land that mastered the geometry of death and the preservation of the spirit thousands of years before these western pines ever sprouted from the dirt. I wasn't going to let some parasitic woodland anomaly rewrite my reality. I forced my trembling right hand into my pocket and pulled out my heavy surgical scalpel. Without a second thought, I pressed the sharp tip into the palm of my left hand, right across the fresh medical bandage, slicing deep into the flesh. The sharp, white-hot sting of physical pain cut through the entity's psychological fog like a beacon of absolute clarity. I squeezed my fist, letting my own warm, living blood mix with the fine gray ash falling around me. Using my crimson-stained fingers, I dragged my hand across the old oak floorboards, drawing a thick, heavy geometric boundary line across the center aisle, a classic, unbroken circle of containment based on the old texts I had studied long ago. I poured my intent, my identity, and my absolute clinical refusal into that boundary. The moment the circle was completed, the swirling ash vortex slammed into the invisible spiritual barrier and violently recoiled. The towering shadow of soot above the altar shrieked, its form fragmenting as the blue flames on the candles flared wildly, shifting from freezing blue to a hot, natural orange for a fraction of a second. The psychic pressure inside my head snapped like a frayed cable. I stood back up, wiping the fresh blood from my face, my eyes locked onto the thrashing, trapped entity on the altar. I had anchored my mind to the physical world, and the creature realized that Dr. Ferris wasn't going to be broken that easily. The shrieking of the faceless shadow grew distant, shifting from a triumphant roar into a desperate, hollow echo that sounded like a winter gale dying out in a deep canyon. The thick, ink-black tree roots that had anchored themselves to the stone altar began to stiffen, their sickly blue luminescence fading into a dull, dead gray. The unnatural, sub-zero pressure that had kept me pinned to the chapel floor lifted entirely, and I could feel the warm, natural circulation returning to my numbed fingertips. The first long, pale ray of the morning sun finally broke through the stained glass windows of the old chapel, cutting through the swirling gray soot like a golden blade. The moment the natural light touched the altar, the entire spiritual manifestation collapsed. The freezing blue flames on the candelabras snapped out instantly, replaced by the faint, mundane smell of smoldering wax. The towering silhouette of ash disintegrated into a harmless cloud of fine dust, settling quietly over the empty oak pews. I stood up, my boots crunching over the gritty floor as I stepped past my completed circle of blood. I walked up to the stone altar to verify the state of the casualty. The giant had returned to a state of absolute, biological stillness. The massive, 7-foot frame of Dr. Arthur Vance was no longer vibrating with an ancient pulse. The writhing black roots filling his open chest had completely dried up, turning into brittle, dead wood that crumbled into ordinary ash at the slightest touch of my forceps. His unhinged jaw was resting naturally now, the aggressive, mocking resonance entirely gone from his blackened features. The entity had fled, retreating back into the dense, foggy depths of the Cascade Mountains the moment the sun reclaimed the city. I didn't stay in the chapel to contemplate the dark. I forced my exhausted muscles to move, dragging the now static, heavy corpse back down to the sub-basement morgue. By the time I finished suturing the massive Y incision with heavy, industrial twine, the regular day shift staff began to trickle back into the building. They walked into the corridors with sheepish, terrified expressions, their eyes darting nervously to the corners of the rooms. They looked at my ruined scrubs, the fresh bandage wrapped around my sliced left palm, and the dried blood near my ears. They expected me to be a madman, or a corpse. But I just stood there by the wash sink, thoroughly cleaning my surgical steel instruments with clinical precision. When the chief administrator finally gathered the courage to hand me the digital tablet, his hand was shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. I took the electronic pen and signed the official autopsy report with absolute, unwavering clarity, Dr. Ferris. In the official cause of death column, I wrote exactly what their modern legal system required to close the file: severe thermal trauma and asphyxiation due to an isolated vehicular fire. I didn't mention the roots. I didn't mention the freeze. They wanted a clinical lie to protect their fragile peace of mind, and I gave it to them. An hour later, I walked out of the hospital's service entrance and into the freezing morning air. The relentless Pacific Northwest rain had finally stopped, replaced by a thick, heavy white fog that rolled in from Puget Sound, completely swallowing the base of the towering steel skyscrapers of downtown Seattle. The skeptics who walk these damp concrete streets will never understand what lies just beyond the tree line, boss. They look at the fog and think it's just weather. They think their modern medicine, their bright lights, and their wealth can insulate them from the ancient things that wait in the deep woods. But you and I know the truth now. The dark doesn't disappear just because you build a city over it. I survived this Pacific night, and I learned that the roots of the world are much older and darker than the concrete of New York. This case is closed, the paperwork is filed, and my coat is packed. But the fog is always rolling in, and whatever dark file lands on my table next, I'll be ready for it.